Police officer beats black man, but kneels down when he discovers his true identity. He was on his knees, not out of faith, nor out of respect, kneeling out of fear. In the middle of the street, in a sweat-soaked uniform, gun in its holster, sweat dripping down his face, his forehead almost touching the hot pavement, as if searching for a crack to disappear into. Behind him, the shouts were muffled. "It's all recorded. Coward. Now apologize." But the most painful sound was his own breathing, rapid, ragged, the breathing of someone who, for the first time, saw the other side of the mirror. In front of him, in complete silence, stood Vicente, upright, but wounded. His suit torn at the shoulder, shirt stained with dried blood, the badge hanging crooked around his neck, one hand pressing against his ribs, the other hanging limp, as if he didn't even have the strength to point. And yet, he was standing. There was something deeply wrong with that image, the police officer, the symbol of authority, on his knees, and the black man, beaten, standing tall. It made no sense to someone who always knew who could give orders and who had to bow their head. The silence between them lasted seconds, but it was long enough for everyone around to pull out their cell phones and start recording. Vicente said nothing. His body ached, his ribs burned, but he did not fall. He took a deep breath, as if breathing itself were an act of resistance. He closed his eyes and remembered his father's voice. "Son, we need to make it home in one piece. That alone is a victory." Minutes before, he had been on the ground, pushed, attacked, humiliated in front of everyone. His briefcase was ripped away, his papers kicked, called a bum, a suspect. But he did not scream, because screaming might have meant never getting up again. The only weapon he carried was his composure, and even that was nearly taken from him. Only when the officer found the documents bearing the Human Rights Commission seal, the name Dr. Vicente Barbosa, and the international entity's signature, everything changed. The attacker's voice faltered. His eyes, once blazing with authority, now pleaded for an explanation to save him. "I'm sorry," he stammered. I didn't know." Vicente, with a dry mouth and a nearly lost voice, replied without blinking, "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I am. The problem is thinking you could do this to anyone." The crowd choked in silence. Someone muttered a low, "Damn." Another whispered, "This has to go nationwide." And it did. The footage went viral in minutes. Headlines read, "Officer kneels after beating Human Rights Commission lawyer." But what nobody saw in the recording was what happened next. Vicente refused immediate medical attention. He said, "There are worse-off people who still don't have anyone to speak up for them." He gathered the scattered papers, one by one. He folded them, put them away, even shaking, even bleeding, and he walked alone to the nearest precinct. There he filed a formal complaint. And he said, "I want this video to protect those who have no badge, no briefcase, no voice." By that night, the video had over 2 million views, but Vicente didn't watch a single one. He sat in the dark, in his living room, ribs bandaged, staring at a frame on the wall. It was an old photo. He and his father, in front of the first house they built with their own hands. Vicente whispered, as if praying, "I came back in one piece, Dad, but I don't know for how long." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath. He knew what was coming wouldn't be a victory. It would be war. And all he wanted was to keep standing. The first time Vicente saw a black man shoved by a police officer, he was 9 years old. The second time, it was his own father. It was a sweltering Friday afternoon when Mr. Antonio came back from the market with his wooden cart. He'd sold everything, lettuce, kale, green onions, and was heading home light and happy. But he'd forgotten his cap, and that was enough. At the corner of Central Avenue, a patrol car pulled up. 2 officers got out. One asked what he was carrying, even though the cart was empty and his vendor ID was visible in his pocket. "I'm heading home, sir," he said, his voice steady. But the right answer that day would have been silence. The shove was quick, the tone aggressive, the humiliation public. Vicente watched from across the street, gripping a bag of bread, his feet glued to the pavement. He wanted to scream, to run, to do something. But his father looked at him, just once, and shook his head slowly. "Stay right where you are, son. Stay safe." Those unspoken words marked him most of all. Years later, Vicente still remembered that look and the pain swallowed whole. That night, Mr. Antonio never spoke of it. He simply sat down at the table, sipped cold coffee and said, "The world isn't fair, son, but we can't let it steal the little we have left, our dignity." That's when Vicente learned to stand tall without shouting. His childhood unfolded in the same neighborhood where years later he himself would be attacked. Every corner held a memory, every wall a scar. But what hurt most wasn't the confrontations, it was how people normalized them. That's just how it is. They were just doing their job. "You should have answered better." Vicente grew up hearing those phrases and decided every day never to repeat them. He studied on scholarships, borrowed study guides, and a single notebook reused for 3 years. His father would say, "What we lack in money, we make up with discipline." And he did. He became the first in his family to go to college, law school, not to change the world, but to try to change his community. On graduation day, Mr. Antonio didn't pose for photos. He stood at the back of the hall in his worn button-down, pants pressed by hand, tears in his eyes. "Dr. Barbosa," he said, voice trembling with pride. "But to me, you'll always be my boy." 2 years later, his father died of a stroke. Vicente held his hand until the very end. In their last conversation, Mr. Antonio repeated, "The world won't respect you just because you have a diploma, but never let it take away your right to stand tall." That memory came flooding back to Vicente as he sat on the bench at the precinct, his body aching and the black folder in his arms. He murmured the mantra, "Come back in one piece. Stand tall. Come back in one piece. Stand tall." He knew the fight ahead wasn't just about him. It was about the 9-year-old boy across the street who still lived inside him. A boy who never forgot what he saw. The file weighed less than a pound, but carried the burden of a generation. Vicente called it the dossier of shame. 87 pages of cold headings, numbers, legalese, but between each line were lives, stories. He would never forget the first one. "His name was Riquelme," said Mrs. Sonia, sitting on the edge of her bed with a doll in her lap. She was a single mother of 3. The oldest, Riquelme, was 14 when he disappeared. The last time anyone saw him, he was on his way to soccer practice, cleats in his bag. A patrol car stopped him 3 blocks from home. No record, no report, no footage. "They said they didn't see him, that he must have run off with the wrong crowd," she said, voice breaking. "But he just wanted to play." She retrieved a blue folder, newspaper clippings, school notes, a tryout application for a local team. At the back was a pencil drawing, Riquelme in his uniform, hugging his mother. "He told me that when he was famous, he'd get me out of here and buy a house that didn't leak when it rained." Vicente held the drawing in silence, feeling its weight like a death certificate signed with love. She looked at him and asked without tears, because she had none left, "Promise me this will reach whoever needs to see it." Vicente nodded. He folded it carefully and slipped it into the envelope with the stats and expert reports. "It will, I promise." Back at the commission, he spent sleepless nights rereading testimonies, fixing commas, organizing exhibits. Each printed page felt like reopening a wound. He knew he couldn't fail. He knew these stories needed more than protocol. They needed urgency. On delivery day, he put on his finest suit, adjusted his badge, and zipped up the black folder. Before leaving, he slipped Riquelme's drawing among the first pages. "This isn't just paper, it's proof we exist," he whispered. He left the commission at 10:22 a.m. At 10:47, he stopped at a bakery to buy water. That's when he saw the patrol car. 2 officers, stare fixed, posture rigid, the usual approach. But Vicente didn't run. He didn't flinch. He gripped the folder like a shield. The clock read 10:49. Vicente had already witnessed dozens of stops. He'd heard shouts, run to help, filed reports on bodies he never saw again. But that morning, it was him, the man in the suit, with the folder in his hand, with his name on the badge. And still, not enough. "Hey, you there, stop right now, hands up!" shouted the officer as he stepped out of the cruiser. Vicente turned slowly, tried to speak. "I'm with the Human Rights Shut up, hands on your head!" The second cop came up behind, gun in plain sight, heavy hand on his shoulder. Vicente raised his arms, tried to hold his gaze. The folder slipped from his grasp. It burst open on the pavement like an exposed wound. Papers flew everywhere. Riquelme's drawing slid across the asphalt. "What you hiding there, little doc?" mocked the first officer, kicking the papers. "Lawyer suit, bum soul." Vicente said nothing. He just breathed, counting in his head, 1, 2, 3. He felt his knee hit the ground, his left wrist twisted behind his back, his right hand scraped raw on the asphalt. Pain shot through his ribs like a blade. His breaths came shallow. The world around him muffled, but he didn't scream, because screaming could mean the end. People started to stop. Someone pulled out a phone, started recording. "What did he do?" a woman shouted. "Nothing. He was just standing there," a man answered. The officer spun around, annoyed. "Move back. You're interfering with the operation." Operation. That word they used to justify abuse. Vicente tried to lift his head. "My name is Vicente Barbosa. I'm a commission rep." The officer yanked open the zipper on the folder, saw the official seal, the international letterhead, his name, printed, signed, recognized. He froze. His hand shook. The other cop, puzzled, asked, "What's wrong?" The aggressor didn't answer. He just dropped the documents like they were burning. Vicente, still kneeling, turned to face him. They locked eyes. The silence was brutal. Then, without warning, the officer knelt. Not out of respect, but out of panic. He knew he'd messed up. He knew he was being filmed. He realized he wasn't abusing a nobody anymore, but a name. The crowd, once distant, now closed in. They recorded. They shouted, "Apologize! This needs to be reported! Look at that man's condition!" Vicente rose slowly. He shook, but he didn't fall. His suit was torn, his hands dirty, his face cut, but his eyes steady. The officer stammered, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Vicente replied evenly, "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I am. The problem is thinking you could do this to anyone." His words exploded across social media within minutes. But there on that street no one spoke again, because in that moment they weren't looking at a man, they were looking at a mirror. And for the first time, all of America saw themselves. The video didn't show everything. It didn't show the moment the officer slammed Vicente's face into the asphalt, nor his struggle to stay conscious. It started in the middle, when he was already standing, and the cop was kneeling. But what came next couldn't be edited out. The footage spread like fresh blood in an open wound. Vicente in a torn suit, badge swinging, ribs aching, standing, voice unwavering. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I am. The problem is thinking you could do this to anyone." That was enough for people to react. People who'd never spoken up, people who'd seen other violences, but now felt this one had a face, a name. Yet alongside the outrage came fury, backlash, attempts to silence him. They began slowly. A comment here, another there. Surely he isn't that innocent. If he got beaten, he must have done something. He asked for it. Playing victim. Then came distorted videos, fake articles, insinuations. Anonymous sites claimed Vicente never graduated, that he'd forged documents, that he was a radical activist. Vicente read them in silence. No denials, no defenses. But he felt it, like slow poison coursing within. He slept little, ate less. Calls multiplied. Some were threats. Others asked if he should even go on. That's when the commission called him. A public hearing is being scheduled. They want you to speak. He hesitated. Speak about what? Your truth. Vicente paused for a moment, then answered, "It will be in my own words, no filter, no script." That morning, the auditorium was packed. Seats filled by students, reporters, lawyers, mothers of victims. Vicente walked in slowly. No new suit, no makeup. He wanted them to see the marks. On his body and in his soul. He mounted the stage, adjusted the mic and said, "I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because by chance someone recorded it. Because by chance someone filmed me standing." He paused. But what about those who weren't filmed? Those left on the ground? Those still missing? Silence fell deep. This isn't about me. It's about every person beaten when nobody was watching. Every young person who goes home afraid they might not make it alive. Another heavy silence. If you think I'm here because I hold a PhD, you're mistaken. I'm here because I survived, and only because of that can I speak. At first, there was no applause. Throats were too tight, frozen by the pain of recognizing themselves in his words. Then the applause came. Some rose to their feet, some wept. But Vicente walked off the stage just as he'd walked on, with the ache in his chest and his resolve renewed. Because now he knew his voice was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who was never allowed to shout. He entered the school as if stepping into a minefield, not out of fear, but because he knew that there, any wrong word could crush too many hopes. Vicente had been invited by a teacher, an 8th grade class, a public school in the same neighborhood where he was attacked. When he arrived, he expected disinterest, but he found silence, attentive eyes, drawings plastered to the walls. In one, a child had drawn a man in a suit with wounds on his face, holding a scale. "That's you, sir, the teacher," one student said. Vicente didn't correct him. He wasn't a teacher. But then, he wasn't just a lawyer either. He stood in front of the class, took a deep breath, and asked, "Has anyone here ever been stopped by the police?" More than half the hands went up. "And has anyone felt guilty just for being afraid?" This time, every hand shot up, slowly, sheepishly. Vicente stepped over to a boy in the front row. "What's your name?" "Yuri." "Ah, and how do you feel when you see a patrol car?" "I freeze," he whispered, "because it feels like I'm the one at fault, even when I've done nothing." Vicente was silent for a few seconds, then said, "I still freeze, Yuri, to this day." The boy's eyes went wide. "But you're a lawyer, and they still treated me like nothing, because before they saw me as a lawyer, they saw me as you." Yuri looked down, but he smiled, a small, shy smile. Vicente left that school with his soul full of wounds and seeds. But night brought the other side of the coin. When he got home, there was an envelope under the door. No return address, yellowed paper, crooked handwriting. Inside, a handwritten note. "You forgot your place. If you keep showing off, you'll end up like the rest." Vicente closed his eyes, sat on the couch. The note shook in his hands, but it wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, because his body had already been beaten. But his soul knew more was coming. Still, the next morning he went back to the commission, sat at the table, opened his laptop, and continued the report. Because Vicente knew symbols don't choose to be symbols, they stay standing when everyone expects them to fall. He didn't want tributes or a stage or headlines. Vicente just wanted to keep doing his job, delivering reports, collecting stories, trying in his own way to keep more names from becoming statistics. But the story had other plans. Without warning, City Hall called a solemn session. A plaza was renamed in his honor. Public schools began using his image in citizenship pamphlets. Vicente thanked them, but didn't attend. That night, he stayed home, on the porch, with room-temperature coffee in his hands and warm silence in his chest. He only rose when the intercom buzzed. It was a woman, short hair, steady gaze, dressed simply, spoke softly. "I'm Riquelme's mother." Vicente said nothing. He just nodded. She pulled an envelope from her bag. Inside, a copy of the drawing, the same one he'd slipped into the report. Now laminated, protected, untouched. "I didn't want this to be forgotten, and I thought you'd like to know that, in some way, it helped." Vicente held the drawing in both hands. He studied every line, the cleats, the uniform, the drawn embrace. And then, he said, he wasn't forgotten. He became a beacon. The woman smiled and left without another word. Vicente went back inside, framed the drawing in a simple frame, hung it in his living room next to his father's photo. And that night he slept without fear. No camera rolling, no badge around his neck, no folder in his hand. He slept whole. Because for the first time he understood that staying standing is not just about resistance. It's about letting others learn to rise too. The next morning, as he walked down a back street in the neighborhood, a little girl recognized him. "Hi, mister. You're the one who stayed standing, right?" Vicente stopped, smiled with his eyes. "I'm just someone who refused to stay on the ground." The girl ran off. She carried those words with her. And right there, on that street where it all began, Vicente knew the fight doesn't end. But sometimes it changes shape and becomes a mirror. If this story moved you, write in the comments, "I fight." Because every act of resistance starts this way, with someone who chooses, even wounded, to keep standing.